Hey, this is Dino, and I want to talk through using OAuth client credentials with Apigee. So OAuth was originally defined about 10 years ago um, in an IETF RFC 6749, which I'm showing here. It was finalized, I think, in October 2012. Now, there have been some updates since then, but most of this still applies. And it describes how you can create an application that requests a token and then uses an access token to request service. And the thing that we're going to be focusing on today is the client credentials grant type, in which a client sends in a request for a token to an authorization server. The authorization server verifies the credentials that the client presents and then returns back a short-lived credential called an access token. The client can then use that access token for subsequent service requests. And the RFC describes what a request for token would look like. It's a post usually to an endpoint or a URL path that ends in token. And the client needs to pass in the encoded client credentials as well as a grant type, fairly simple post request, and then gets a response back that includes often an opaque access token that can then be used in subsequent requests. Okay, so we're going to use Apigee to do that. Let's open up our Apigee. First thing we want to do is create a new API proxy to demonstrate this. So first thing I'll create a no target API proxy. In general, Apigee uses or runs reverse proxies. That is to say, a client will send in a request to Apigee, and Apigee will do some validation or checking of the request before creating a new request to an upstream system, and then getting the response from the upstream and relaying the response back to the original client. In that respect, Apigee is a reverse proxy. This case, we're not doing that. We're creating a proxy that is a loopback, so it hits Apigee, and then Apigee just responds directly. And what I'll do is I'll add in some instructions to just respond with kind of a fixed, more or less fixed response. So to do that, I'll add a policy. So I've got my API proxy. You saw me create that. I'll add a policy, the assign message policy, and we're just going to call that am-response. And this is going to be for assign message of the response. And when I do that, I get presented with a full template of the assign message policy. I don't need all of this. Really what I want to do is just set a header and a payload. So I'm going to use the set instruction. And the reason I want to set a header is just for kind of diagnostic purposes. So I know how to do this. You can read about the syntax in the documentation, which is accessible here. But what I want to do is set a response header called API proxy. And the contents of that will be the name of the API proxy. And I'm actually going to use a message template. So it's this thing will be interpreted at runtime, and the variables that I reference in here within curly braces will be replaced. So this is one of the variables that I want, API proxy name, and then the revision, API proxy dot revision. So that's going to be a dynamic value. And let's just close out the XML headers element. I also want to set the payload. So and this syntax is maybe not familiar with you, but you can learn all about it by looking at the documentation or lots of different examples. And I'm just going to use hello world. This thing in here is also a message template. So I can insert things like the message ID, which is a unique identifier that Apigee generates and applies to every message. So it's going to have hello world and then the message ID. Then I don't need any of this other stuff. But there is one other thing I want to do, and that is I want to remove headers. So in the Apigee runtime, if the API proxy is a loop back, what Apigee does is it copies the request headers into the response and then sends back those request headers in the response. We don't want that. So by using this notation in the policy configuration, it's just telling Apigee, remove all those headers that you had previously copied from the request into the response. Just remove them, and we'll have a clean slate, and we'll just add one new header. So that's my assign message policy. So I created the policy, I've configured it, and of course I can save it, but it's not really attached. What I want to do is attach that to the response. So when Apigee receives this request, I want that response to be the one that Apigee sends back. So I've now attached it to the response in the preflow, and when this API proxy receives a request, it'll respond with that message. So the next thing I need to do is deploy it, and this takes about 60 seconds. Okay. That proxy is now deployed, and just to help us kind of visualize what's happening, I'm going to start a debug session. So I'll select the debug tab and the revision and start a debug session. And now I'm going to flip over to my Postman. So I've got a collection that is able to send requests in, and I'm using a variable here, which is specified in the Postman environment. The environment I'm using is this one, and the endpoint is just the endpoint for my Apigee ingress. So that's what is being sent to, and this is the base path of that API proxy I just created. So let's send that, and you can see what I get back is a hello world, and then that GUID or UUID, which will be different for every response. You can see as I send more of these things in, I'm getting a different one back. That's that message template that I referred to with the message ID. And if I flip back to the Apigee window, you can see I sent 4 requests in, and you can see I've got 4 transactions here, and each one is just invoking this assign message. It's setting the API proxy header and setting the response content to hello world plus that message ID. All right, so all that's working great, just as we expected. Now what we want to do is add in credential verification into that API proxy. So let's delete the debug session. Now we're going to add a new policy, and for this one it's going to be OAuth, and I'm going to name this OAuth to verify access token. The OAuth2 policy does lots of things, but one of the things that it does is verify an access token, and the configuration for that is really simple. Just need the operation element, and I think that's it. So all that looks good. I don't need those attributes, and I'm going to save this. Now as I save it, because I added a new policy, it's giving me a new revision, and because the prior revision has already been deployed, so I get a new revision. But remember, this thing isn't attached yet, so let's go back to my preflow, and as we saw earlier, I've attached the assign message policy to the response flow, and you can see the XML for it here. Now I want the verify access token to be in the request flow. Obviously putting it in the response will be too late, so let's click this icon. We'll select the existing policies. That's the one I want. Add that in, and now my proxy, my loopback proxy, does just 2 things. It verifies an access token, and then if the token's good, it sets a sort of a canned response. So I'll save that, and then once again I need to deploy the updated revision. This is going to take 60 seconds, so let's do that. Okay, that's deployed, this loopback proxy now with the updated policy. Now we're going to go back again into the debug tab. We're going to start a debug session, and I'm going to go back to Postman and try the same request. And what you can see now is I'm getting a response that is not that hello world response. Instead, it's an error response. It's got a 401 status code, and it's telling me, hey, you've got an invalid access token. Flipping back to Apigee, I can see, I should be able to see the trace session. And I can see that the verify access token policy has executed, but seeing no token because I didn't pass one, it's rejecting that request and sending back a 401. All right, so how do we get a token? Let's stop this debug session. We may need this later, so we'll just keep that running. But now what I'm going to do is open a new tab and create the entities that I need in order to get a token. So first thing I need, or the main thing I need, is an app. An app is the thing that Apigee issues that has a client ID and secret on it. But an app is issued to a developer. It's owned by a developer. So before I create the app, I need a developer. And an app is authorized for a product. So before I create the app, I need to create a product. So let's start with the product. I'll open that in a new tab. And I'll just create a new product here. We'll call it new-product-A. And I need to fill in that display name, specify that it will work in that environment. The access is public. I'm not going to explain all these other things. This is just the basics. I do need to specify an API proxy and the operations on an API proxy. So what proxy do I want? I want the loopback proxy that I've created. And I can then specify a set of verb path combinations. And for my purposes, I'm just going to say get, post, put, delete on any path in that proxy will be allowed. So that is what the product allows. It allows access to this proxy, any path, and any of those 4 verbs. So that's my API product. At this point, I need a developer. So let's create one of those. Create the developer. We'll call it December developer, developer, and developer at example.net. This email does not need to be valid. It's useful to have the email of the developer if you want to notify the developer on changes in your API program and so on. But it doesn't need to be valid in order to be usable. All right, so now I've got a developer, I've got an API product, and now I want to create an app. So let's do that. Create the new app. This will be new app A. For this date, I'll select the developer I just created, December developer, and we'll apply some credentials, and we'll say this is going to expire in 90 days. Different organizations have different policies on credential rotation. Some have no, you can have never expiring credentials. Some say you got to rotate them every year. That's all supported in Apigee. You can do it any way you want. This is the product that I just created, so I want to authorize this app for that product. And once I click create, I'll see the client ID and the client secret. Okay, so let's copy that. We'll go back into Postman, and that is not in itself a token. That I can use in my request for token. So before I'm able to use this this client ID and secret, I need a token granting proxy. So let us go back, open a new tab, and we'll create a new API proxy that grants tokens according to client credentials. Where are we going to get that? Well, I've got a pre-baked API proxy. If you go to this GitHub repo, and I'll drop that in the video notes. And clone that, you'll have access to it. So let's create a work directory, and we'll cd into that, and then we'll git clone this repo. Okay, and then I'm going to cd into that thing that I just cloned. The client credentials proxy is going to be in here, and this is the one that I'm interested in. That API proxy is deployable. Oops, not zip, but unzip. I can see the contents of that, and this is basically something that you can just import right into Apigee. So let's do that. Let's go back in here, we'll create new, and one of the options in the wizard is upload a proxy bundle. So we'll select that. The path is this for me. So I'm going to specify that. And which one do I want? CC, yes, that's for client credentials. So I'll open that. I'm going to call this API proxy OAuth2 CC, and that'll be created. Then I'm going to edit it, and I won't go into examining the how this API proxy works, but the main point is that it implements the server side of this request. So it's going to handle an inbound post that returns back a token. So we can go in and deploy that revision, and this will take just a minute or so. Okay, that API proxy is now deployed. This is the token dispensing API proxy, and I'm going to do the same thing with this one. I'm going to start a debug session. Now, in my prior tab, I have the app, so I'm going to flip back to that tab. Here's my client ID. I'm going to copy that and go back to Postman. Here in the request for token, I need to specify that. So there are, it's a post request. It's to that path. The body will be form URL encoded, just like the spec says. There's one parameter, grant type, and that value is fixed. It's called client credentials. The authorization I can specify here, I can say I want this to be basic auth, and I want that to use these values. So I'll paste in the client ID, and I'm also going to need the client secret here. And what Postman is going to do is concatenate the client ID and the client secret with a colon, and then base64 encode that and put that in a request header, an authorization header that looks just like this one. So that's just what we want, and it'll send that off. So now I think I've got all the requirements, and I'm getting back an access token. So this is now an access token that I can use for subsequent requests to my loopback proxy. So if we flip back to the trace, you can see here's the post, here's the inbound request. These are all the values. There's a URL encoded content type. The authorization header is a basic auth blob. It's not shown here. You can see this is coming in from Postman. And the policy here is a generate access token policy. I won't get into all the details on how that works, but basically it's just validating the client ID and the client secret, and then if everything looks good, it generates this access token and sends that back to the calling client. So that's exactly the same token that we received in Postman, so that's all as expected. So now we have a token. Let's see it work. So let's start another trace session here in my loopback proxy. Okay, so this is the one that verifies tokens and then just assigns that static message. So we're going to select this request in my Postman collection and paste in the token. So the way to do that is here in the authorization, you can select OAuth2, and where do you want to add in the OAuth token in the headers. So it's going to put it in the authorization header, and then I'll just paste in that static value that I just created and make sure that the prefix is still bearer. That's important. And then when I send that in, you can see the response is coming back as expected with that hello world and the message ID. And then I can do that as many times as I want, and I'll get a slightly different response for those requests. If I go back to my trace, I can see, this is the verify access token, and then the response, assigning the static response or the canned response. So one more thing I want to kind of point out here is the first request. by selecting this policy, I can see how long things take in the Apigee runtime. The first request, it looks like it took 59 milliseconds, and if I send subsequent requests, I'll just send a few more, flip back to the trace. This one took only 7 milliseconds, 6 milliseconds, 16 milliseconds, and the reason for that is after the token has been seen once by Apigee, that token gets cached. So subsequent validation of the same token takes much less time. The first time, Apigee needs to read from storage, from persistent store, and that causes I/O, and that's going to take a little bit of time. But on subsequent requests, the token validation is pretty fast. Okay, so what did we see? We saw creating an API proxy. This one happens to be a loopback. It doesn't connect to any upstream. It does a couple things. It verifies an OAuth token and then assigns a message. We saw the entity model in Apigee, which required us to create an app which relates a developer to an API product and gives us a client ID and secret. We saw how to use that client ID and secret in a request for a token, and we used the token granting proxy to facilitate that. The main policy, this is where it all happens, it's this OAuth2 generate access token policy, and that's the configuration there, and you can read about that just by looking at the help information by clicking this link. So we saw also how to import an API proxy from a zip bundle in the file system. So that's all kind of handy stuff to know as you're getting started. I hope this has been a good introduction to Apigee, the API proxy idea and metaphor, policies, in particular OAuth related policies like verify access token and generate access token. If there's any questions on any of this, just drop a note in the comments. So I hope it's been helpful. Till next time, keep it digital.